Okay, so welcome to the second part of Sundown Towns. And this part is going to talk about history and present day segregation. And when I talk about this, I get a standard question I always get from students is, well, how do we fix this then? Or what's the solution? Those questions often emerge after we talk about some social problem. Now, I don't have like a prepackaged, easy one sentence solution to the myriad of complicated problems that we're going to talk about that have been built up over hundreds of years. Now, this has been a particularly difficult problem to fix. It's been difficult to fix the problems of racial segregation, even as virtually no one says they support racially segregated neighborhoods. There's virtually no public support for racially segregated neighborhoods, at least overt support. So, part of the reason why it's difficult to fix is that the systems that generated these patterns, as we talked about last time, were often race neutral, at least nominally, at least in name. And they needed to be to stay constitutional. They were often intended to produce racial segregation, but that means two things. The fact that race wasn't in the original ordinances and a lot of the laws that created these racial segregated neighborhoods means that a law that says it's illegal to purposefully racially segregate communities is likely to do little to fix the problem. Again, this is why it's important to understand how we got here in the first place so we know how to begin developing solutions. The second part is that individual preferences are not necessarily the source of this, or at least not solely in terms of racial attitudes or racist attitudes, which is where a lot of Americans default back to when they look for explanations of racism. And I started the last lecture off with this idea that if there's racism, then there must be individual present day racists to blame it on. But the basic idea of systemic racism and talking about systemic racism says we don't actually need those individual racists actively doing racist things in the way we think of racism to end up with a racially unequal society because it's been created from the past. We just do nothing and it will maintain itself. As a matter of fact, as I'm going to argue later on in the course, if we do nothing, the racial inequality is actually going to get worse. So, first, let's think about what it means to fix the problems created by the past. Let's think about this overtly racist Jim Crow era in the American South. Think about how we fix a problem like this: the problem of these separate water fountains that were designed to send messages of inferiority to people. Well, we could just paint over this. We just paint over this, and then we have two water fountains. It's a fairly easy fix. And I don't mean easy that it was easy to accomplish. There was a lot of violence associated with trying to make this happen. The way the South actually resisted was to do what they did with things like public pools in Jackson, Mississippi. So this is a public pool in Jackson, Mississippi in the 1960s, a segregated pool. So if you were black in Jackson, Mississippi back in the 1960s, you could go to one out of the four pools that was reserved for you. And the other three pools were, of course, better funded and bigger and stuff like that. And there were three of them versus one of them. And that wasn't proportional to the population. So the Civil Rights Act passes and says you can't do that anymore. All the pools have to be integrated. So what Jackson, Mississippi does is it privatizes the pools. And by making them private and turning them into private pool clubs, then they can kind of get around the law. And you see this happening with the private schools begin to develop a lot in the South, voucher programs to send kids to private schools. So you'll take public money that would have went to the public schools and you'll give it to parents so they can use it as vouchers for private schools. And the private schools, since they're private, they can decide who gets admitted to their schools, which in effect makes them these kind of segregation academies that develop in the South in the 60s and 70s. But you can do a lot to public space. So the signs can be removed. Markers of white social space can be torn down many, many years later. But eventually that happens, or they could just be redecorated, get a makeover as this happened. But this is a statue of Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general, basically the leader of the Army of Enslavement. And this was meant to honor that leader of the Army of Enslavement, or at least ignore that that's exactly what his army was engaged in, as if some people's lives don't matter and we can just ignore that that's what his army would do. If they caught people that were former slaves or looked like they could be slaves or were just black, they would be enslaved. That's what he was fighting for. And he has this place of honor in Richmond, Virginia, which has been recently redecorated. That's easy to fix in this marker of social space. We can take down this statue. We could do this to this statue. We can paint over those signs. But this is harder to do away with. So this is a map of Richmond, Virginia, and this has to do with what was called redlining. So remember I talked about last time, I talked about the Federal Housing Act and how they were only giving out backing, the government was only backing loans to those in racially homogenous neighborhoods. But what the banks did was they created these maps with the help of the FHA. And so these green areas and some of these blue areas and yellow areas, those were kind of okay to make loans to. They were thought of as stable neighborhoods. Whereas these red areas, and that's where the term redlining comes around because they're colored in red in these maps, those were areas where banks wouldn't give loans. And so this is the places where Black people had to get houses on contract when we talked about the problem with that last time. So this is essentially the map that creates that bifurcated system where if you're Black, you can't get a mortgage, where if you're white, you can get a mortgage. This is a map of Richmond today, same city. And what this does is looking at the 2010 census data, which is the last census that we have. Its census is done every 10 years. And it's mapping the census data because we track race in the census data, one dot, one person here. Blue is white, green is Black, red is Asian, orange is Hispanic, and there's a purple other color here. And you see, if you look at the Richmond metro area, that we have these areas which are white and these areas which are Black, right? And then we have an Asian population in here in the downtown. And that Robert E. Lee statue, while it may eventually come down or it may stay, like this, it overlooks this highly segregated metropolitan area. And it's not just Richmond. This is Detroit. And so again, here's the Black population, here's the white population, and this is actually the border of Detroit here. This is one of the most segregated borders in the United States, the border between Detroit and its suburbs out here. And of course, these suburbs were places where there was open discrimination against Blacks in the past, and the redlining and blockbusting and all the stuff we talked about last time happened, but it's still here. This is 2010. This is New Jersey here, so this is the Camden area, this is Philadelphia. And again, you see these stark patterns of racial segregation. Just for comparison, here's what New Brunswick looks like. This is New Brunswick, and you see the college campus area shows up as fairly integrated, and so does areas over here. But you can see there's high concentrations of Hispanic here, there's high concentrations of white here, concentrations of Asian here. There's still this segregation going on in our society. So the question becomes why? Why, after so many years, is it still so segregated? Well, let's look at individual preferences. We'll start there. Now, individual preferences still matter, but they matter less and less, and I want to show you this by looking at some data from the 70s and the 90s and the early 2000s. So what they did was they asked white respondents their preferences for moving in or out of a particular neighborhood. And so they said, imagine this is your house here. These houses that are in white are white people. This house that's colored in, that's somebody who's Black or non-white. This is scenario 1. This is scenario 2, where there's still like a white majority here, white majority, slight white majority, and these are kind of, these are integrated neighborhoods and a slight, Black majority. And then they asked them about their preferences, about the attractiveness of the neighborhoods. And so they measured the same question in 76, in 92, and 2004. This is called a longitudinal study. We're measuring over time to look at the change over time. So we're asking the same questions year after year. And so back in 1976, which is right here, where they asked this, and they asked people, would you feel comfortable living in a neighborhood like this? This is a neighborhood where there's only one household, one Black family. 76% in 1976 said they would feel comfortable, meaning that an additional 20 something percent said they would not feel comfortable living in a neighborhood like this with just one black family. 7% said they would just move out of the neighborhood, openly admitted they would move out of the neighborhood. And only 73% would be willing to move into a neighborhood. Now you see that shifts. By the time we get to 2004, we're up here in the over 90% of whites said, yes, that's fine. They'd feel comfortable in a neighborhood like that. Only 2% are saying they would move. If we look at this neighborhood, which is still a white majority, the numbers start to go down. But there's a change over time. So back in 1976, it's 58%, but it goes up to 83% of whites say they would feel comfortable in that neighborhood. 24% would move out of that neighborhood back in 1976, but only 8% by 2004. As we move down the list and we move to a neighborhood that is slightly a non-white majority down here, we see that here, even as late as 2004, only 51% admit in a survey, and remember, surveys have social desirability response, so people give the answer they think is the socially desirable answer, not necessarily what they would actually do. But that is up again from 28%. So we see this huge decline, if you will, in the people that say they would feel uncomfortable in a neighborhood like this. And while a majority would move out of such a neighborhood in 1976 and 1992, it's a minority by 2004. So white and black segregation has declined with these attitudes since the 1980s. Still, though, blacks remain the most segregated group. What's happened is that since the 1980s, back in the 1980s, the typical white homeowner was racially isolated. 90% of their neighbors were white. And you can see that reflected in the data I just showed you, that the attitudes reflect that. By 2010, which is the latest census we have, 75% of their neighbors were white. And so what has happened is, while this was a kind of a dominant neighborhood for whites back in the 1980s, it has moved more to this one as being the dominant neighborhood, but certainly not neighborhoods like this. Now, like I've pointed out before about why segregation matters. Segregation matters because segregation is used to exclude. And it's people with power, with economic and political resources, excluding people without those things. And so if somebody's poor in America, that's a problem. That leads to all kinds of problems, obviously, right? But it is much better to be poor and live in a middle-class neighborhood or even a fairly affluent neighborhood, which does happen, versus being poor and living in a poor neighborhood, a neighborhood where there's a high concentration of poverty, where over 60% of the people that live in that neighborhood, where the census tract is what we're looking at here, are also poor. Because that means that we essentially have a ghetto, that people are excluded as a group and cut off in many ways from all kinds of economic and political opportunities as well. Because if you have a neighborhood or a town or a city that is really poor, you can elect whoever you want to lead that city, but whoever you elect doesn't have any resources to actually make anything happen. So living in these being poor and also living in a high poverty neighborhood is kind of a double hit on one's opportunity. And as I'm going to show you, that it happens for people that are young. Now, the specific numbers don't matter as much here, but it's the trends and the comparisons that we're going to make. So let's take a look at this one, and I'm going to ask you a couple questions about what's happening here. So first, what it's measuring. So it's looking at the percentage of the population. Here, the population is poor people. So the percentage of poor people who live in high poverty neighborhoods, here's the total. And then we got it by race: white, black, and Hispanic. We're also measuring it over time at 1990 and 2000. We have a measure from 2005 to 2009 and another one from 2009 to 2013. And so we're comparing by racial group. We're comparing over time the percentage of poor people that live in high poverty neighborhoods. I want you to take a close look at this graph, and I'm going to ask you a couple of true-false questions about this graph. Okay, I'm going to do this with one or two more of these graphs as well, because this is really important to understand graphs and charts and what they're actually saying. Because, well, not just for this class, although it is important for this class, but just in general, you are going to consume a ton of statistics throughout your lifetime and charts and graphs trying to make arguments to you. So it's a really important skill to know how to read these. I also read some article about college graduates not being able to read graphs and charts, and I was very, very disturbed by that. So I've built that into virtually every lesson plan, every class I have. So here's the second one. So what this is looking at now is it's looking at the percentage of the total population living in high poverty neighborhoods nationwide. And this is by race / ethnicity, age, and poverty status. And so here we're looking at both the poor and the non-poor, and we're looking at it by age. And so think about somebody growing up in a poor neighborhood. This is going to be really consequential to their life chances. It's going to predict the kind of schools they go to, the neighborhood environment. There's all kinds of research that growing up in poor neighborhoods leads to higher stress levels when you're a kid and actually impacts people's ability to learn, their brains, their stuff like that. So it's a problem that those who are already coming from poor families, that quite a few of them are growing up in these poor neighborhoods. Now, this happens sometimes for people that are not poor. So 16.5% of children from 0 to 5 are growing up in high poverty neighborhoods, whereas only 2.7% of the non-poor happen to be in those neighborhoods. That's very rare if you're white. Less than 1% of children who are coming from families that are not poor, meaning their income isn't below the poverty line. It could be right near the poverty line, but it's not below the poverty line, are in those poor neighborhoods. Where if you're white and you're poor, though, we have higher numbers here, right? And so you can go through these comparisons for Black and Hispanic as well. And so what I'm going to do now is take a quick break and ask you a couple of true-false questions about this chart. All right, so one of the things that I wanted you to see, and I asked the question about it, is comparing this number here, or for a matter of fact, this number, or this number, to these numbers. And what you see here is that if you're Black, coming from a Black family, and even if your family is non-poor, you have greater odds of growing up in a high poverty neighborhood as a child than if you're white and your family is poor. That is the result of racial segregation. There's a trend that's in between here if you look at it for Hispanics and compare Hispanics to whites as well. And so we have these high Black concentration of poverty. So this is looking at the percentage of people that are Black and poor, and they're living in these high poverty neighborhoods. And it's the majority in places like Syracuse. And look at these towns: Syracuse, the states, I'm sorry. New York, Michigan, Ohio, New York, California, New York, Ohio. Here we got Indiana, Wisconsin, and then Kentucky there on the bottom. A lot of these places are in the places that Lowen's talking about. These are these places in the Midwest and in the Northeast where these sundown towns were. This is true for Hispanic concentrations of poverty. It's many of the same places, except for this area in Texas, which is one of the few places you see for high concentrations of white poverty. But here, these numbers are much lower. So white poverty differs from Hispanic or Black poverty in that it is much less likely to be concentrated. So the disadvantages of being poor are much less likely to be accumulating in one space and be concentrated in this concentrated level of disadvantage for those who are white and poor than for those who are Black or those who are Hispanic and poor. Now, as I talked about last time, the same processes that create ghettos are the same processes that create suburban affluence. But the way we think about it is we think about these things as completely separate from one another. And so what I want to talk about in part 2 of this is how that's not really true. Like, these places are connected to one another. The same processes create this inner city ghetto as they create this suburban affluence. And we tend to artificially disconnect the suburbs from the city. And we'll spend some time next time talking about, in the next video, talking about why that's a problem.